The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The Case of the Viennese Waltz King by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Bryan Godwin. It was the summer of 1885 when Holmes and I had a surprise visitor at Baker Street. In the early afternoon, Mrs. Hudson announced a guest from Austria, apparently some sort of musician, as she worded it. When we asked him, about a minute later, a man dressed in a frack, perhaps 50 years old, stood in front of us. He fashioned a distinctive upper mustache, whose tips were slightly twirled upwards, combined with a pointed beard on his chin. His way of wearing his facial hair at first gave us the impression that we were dealing with a member of the German aristocracy, who, in these days, quite often wore their beards in such a fashion. But our visitor proved to be quite bourgeois. "Gentlemen," the man began, in well-articulate but slow and somewhat nasal English, "if it is at all convenient, I would like to assign you to an important case." Holmes looked at him reservedly, but said, "Just go on, sir. But maybe you would like to introduce yourself first, if I may ask?" "Oh, pardon me," replied the gentleman. "I did forget about that. You have to understand, I am a little stressed out, as you tend to say in this country. My name is Eduard Strauss. I am the bandmaster of the Strauss Orchestra in Vienna, as well as the Imperial Royal Monarchy's musical director of the Viennese court ball." Immediately, Holmes approached our guest and shook his hand. "Well, Mr. Strauss," he said, smiling, "it is indeed a great honor." "Oh, the honor is all mine," replied the bandmaster. "I am glad you are receiving me, Mr. Holmes." Then he nodded his head in my direction and added, "Of course, this also applies to you, Dr. Watson." I was a little surprised and equally flattered that our notoriety apparently reached as far as Central Europe, and that my humble self was part of Holmes's fame. Holmes offered Mr. Strauss a seat at the table, and both sat down. "We know, of course," my friend began, "that you are currently on a concert tour, and will have a big concert at St. James's Hall tomorrow, of course accompanied by your brother Johann." "Indeed," Edward Strauss confirmed slightly nervously. "Well, kind of. The accompaniment is more a lead. I only play the second violin in relation to my older brother's great work, and that in the truest sense of the word." Then he looked around the room and discovered Holmes's violin, which was placed next to the music stand. "You're playing the violin, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. Holmes nodded. "Compared to your family, of course, I'm just an amateur," he replied modestly, although his artistry was of high quality, as I have often been able to testify. "May I see the instrument?" continued Strauss. "Certainly," Holmes said. He got up, fetched the violin and bow, and handed it over to our guest. "Go ahead." Strauss looked at the violin in detail. "A Stradivarius, remarkable work." Then he got up, placed the violin on his shoulder, and started playing. When he stopped, he repeated, "A remarkable instrument indeed." "A remarkable composition," Holmes replied. "Composed by your brother, Wiener Blut, if I'm not mistaken." "Exactly," Strauss confirmed, giving back the violin to Holmes. To our surprise, he put on the violin and began to play again, a piece that was unknown to me, while Strauss was visibly moved. When Holmes finished his performance, Strauss applauded. "Excellent, Mr. Holmes," he claimed. "You are worthy of your violin. Even as an amateur, as you call it, you could probably participate in my orchestra at any time." Also, thank you for playing one of my compositions. The Hypothesis Waltz, Holmes explained to me. Of course, I quickly replied. As Holmes put the violin back to its place, he said, Well, Mr. Strauss, you certainly didn't come here to see my Stradivarius. How can we help you? The bandmaster sat down again and took a deep breath. Then he began. As you correctly mentioned, tomorrow our big concert will take place at St. James's Hall. The concert has, of course, sold out long ago, down to the last seat. Unfortunately, we are currently seriously questioning whether the event can take place at all. Please elaborate? Asked Holmes. Well, Mr. Strauss replied, my brother is unfit right now to conduct the concert. Of course, I have been leading the orchestra for years, since the death of our brother Joseph, usually by myself and without him. But Johann's participation at the conductor's desk with his violin is the real attraction of our concert tour. You have to know, Holmes told me, that Johann Strauss hardly appears like that anymore. He has long since shifted to the composition of operettas. There's no time left for waltz and polka evenings. Quite right, Eduard confirmed. However, due to certain circumstances, Johann was nevertheless forced to undertake another international concert tour. What were the circumstances, if I may ask? I interjected. Eduard Strauss hesitated for a moment. Then he said, All right, this may be of importance to your case, so I will have to tell you. But if I may ask, please keep it private. There are certain financial issues that have forced us to do another tour. Of course, said Holmes, who did not seem surprised at all. Let's get back to the state of affairs. Johann does not want or cannot perform tomorrow. Why? Is he sick? Did something happen to him? Rather the latter, in a way, Eduard explained. My brother was robbed last night, and now he is not only highly offended, but also unable to conclude the performance. However, a cancellation, especially disappointing a fully booked crowd after we sold more than 200 tickets, would be our ruin. I had to laugh. For heaven's sake, I said. Why can't your brother get over himself and see this through? What is he missing? A talisman? His frack? The baton? His concert violin, Eduard replied with a serious expression. And that's so important to him? I asked, a little incredulously. That's it, at least for Johann, Eduard confirmed with a sigh. It is an Amati violin from the first half of the 17th century made in Cremona. A unique masterpiece made of highest quality wood, a secret soft paintwork, slightly increased curvature and tension, therefore with an unmatched tone volume. Without his violin, Johann Strauss will simply not perform. I understand, Holmes said. It is therefore absolutely necessary to recover the instrument before tomorrow evening. Otherwise, there would be significant consequences. Well, Mr. Strauss, we're taking over the case. Eduard stood up, relieved. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You are my last hope. The investigator of the London police, a certain Mr. Lestat, or something of the like? Mr. Lestrade, Holmes corrected. At any rate, he seemed overwhelmed, Eduard continued. But he advised me to ask for your help. Inspector Lestrade is certainly a capable investigator, Holmes said, but given the urgency of the matter, it is undoubtedly better if we take care of the matter. The first thing we will have to do is talk to your brother, Johann Strauss. Where can we find him at the moment? He is still in the concert hall, Eduard replied. That is where he noticed the loss of his violin this morning. Ever since then, he's wavering between lethargic depression and roaring fury. My carriage is waiting down the street. We can start as soon as you are ready. A few minutes later, we sat in the extremely comfortable carriage that the concert organizer, Chappelle and Company, had made available to the Strauss brothers for their stay in London. St. James's Hall, our destination, was in Westminster on Regent Street. After a few initial difficulties, the magnificent building, neo-Gothic on the outside and, curiously enough, some of it Arab Andalusian on the inside, had established itself as one of the most important concert stages in England in the last 2 decades, of course with varied programs. Bach, Beethoven, and Wagner were regularly intoned. Dvorak, Grieg, and Tchaikovsky often performed at the conductor's desk and at the concert grand piano, and even Charles Dickens read there, just days before his final heart attack from his last book. The Viennese waltz and operetta, King Johann Strauss, perfectly suited the colorful hustle and bustle of this house. By the time we arrived at Regent Street, Eduard's nervousness had visibly increased. It was certainly not easy for him to carry all the responsibility. All of that in the shadows and dependence of his overpowering elder brother, even more now that a crisis had occurred. Holmes noticed the tension on arrival and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Strauss. We will quickly bring the matter to a positive end. You can rely on that." Although Holmes rarely lacked self-confidence, his optimism seemed a little rash to me. Eduard took us directly to his brother's wardrobe, where he was still sitting. He had refused to return to the hotel until significant progress had been made in recovering the lost instrument. When we entered, Johann Strauss looked at us sharply. "So you're these British master detectives?" he asked in somewhat unpolished English, frowning. Regarding his appearance, Johann was almost the spitting image of his brother, though because of the age difference, his mustache was bushier. He was about 60 years old, and that must have also been the reason why he resorted to coloring his almost gray beard. His personality seemed so much more particular and much more introverted than Eduard. Holmes stepped forward and tried to reach for his hand. "Guten Morgen, Herr Strauss," he began in German, but then switched back to our mother tongue. "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my companion, Dr. John Watson. Your brother asked us to assist you to solve your little problem." Without taking Holmes's hand, Johann began to walk up and down the room, gesticulating violently. "Little problem. This is a big problem. Monstrous downright. Catastrophe. Downfall. Apocalypse." "Your brother probably has a weakness for exaggerations," I whispered to Eduard, which he acknowledged with a tormented smile. Holmes pulled back his hand, saying, "We are well aware that your Amati violin is of immense importance to you, but we are confident that we will be able to recover it." "That's absolutely necessary," cried Johann. "I can't perform without my violin, or could your Dr. Watson operate without a scalpel? And you, Holmes, can you investigate without whatever it is you require?" Holmes tapped his temples, smiling. "My mind is usually sufficient, and I always have that with me." "I am happy for you, Mr. Holmes," Johann attested impatiently. "Well, since time is pressing, we should not waste it any further." He turned to Eduard and said, "Thank you, you can go." To my astonishment, the younger Strauss brother actually left us immediately with a short nod and closed the door to the wardrobe from the outside. "Let's cut to the chase, gentlemen," Johann began when we were alone. "This is a nasty attack on my artistic integrity, a harpoon shot into my musician's heart. They want to do me personal harm." Isn't it at least as likely, I suspected, that the thief recognized the value of the violin and just wanted to make money? Johann raised an eyebrow and said, "I hope you're a good physicist, Dr. Watson, because as a detective—" "He's always a great help," Holmes interrupted him. "Well, Mr. Strauss, Why are you so sure that there is a personal motive underlying this? Were you threatened? The envy is everywhere, cried Johann. Every fair and street musician thinks that they have to compete with me. But that is, of course, impossible. As a matter of fact, ridiculous. That is why these dilettantes resort to sabotage. I am surrounded by unsuspecting and untalented, small-minded idiots. Thanks to my abilities as a good doctor, I was already able to detect psychopathological behavior, overconfidence, and paranoia in his characteristics. But for the time being, I kept my diagnosis to myself. Holmes, for his part, kept his countenance. Well, after all, it's one of these idiots that succeeded with stealing your violin. At least there should be some criminal talent hidden within our perpetrator. Johann's head was red. That's not funny, Mr. Holmes. Am I laughing? My life's work, my historical legacy is at stake. Holmes did not respond to this, but asked, Do you have any specific suspicions? Or maybe even a clue that could lead to the perpetrator? A clue, repeated Johann, laughing briefly. Much better. I have a letter of confession. A letter of confession? Holmes repeated with surprise. Eduard didn't tell us anything about it. Of course not, Johann replied, because he doesn't know about it, as a precaution. Who knows, maybe he himself is the author and thus the thief. You suspect your own brother? I asked. I suspect everyone, Johann replied. You can't be careful enough. He then took a piece of paper from his shirt pocket and handed it to Holmes. I found this note in the empty violin box, he explained. As I stood next to him, Holmes unfolded the paper apart. There were only 3 words in block letters on it, and they were written in Latin. Superbientum animum prosternet, Holmes read. Do you understand? Triumphed Johann. The thief is an idiot. What do you mean? I asked carelessly, as it turned out. Johann's eyes sparkled. Did you not study Latin during your medical studies, Dr. Watson? He said. You have to study in England to practice as a doctor, don't you? Before I could respond, Holmes pointed to the second word. There's a mistake. It must be animus, not animum. Exactly, Johann growled. Like I said, an idiot. I turned to Holmes, and what does that tell us? I don't know yet, Holmes replied. There is a chance that the mistake was made on purpose, but it could have also been an honest mistake. But this is a clear admonition, and basically means pride goes before a fall. Obviously, this did not seem to concern Johann, and he raised his shoulders without understanding, while I couldn't help but crack a certain smile. And what are you going to do? Asked Johann impatiently. You have to do something. Certainly, Holmes replied. If you allow, we will now begin our investigation, although, to be precise, we have already done so in a way. Johann wasn't happy with that explanation. What does that mean? Our method, Holmes began slowly, is based on observation and analysis, questioning and interviewing, deduction and combination. The Waltz king thought for 2 or 3 seconds, and then he said, Well then, don't mind me. Go ahead and get started, gentlemen. Hop, hop. We were relieved when the maestro decided to have dinner in a restaurant. His brother Eduard returned to our side when we were finally able to inspect the crime scene. The violin had disappeared directly from Johann's wardrobe, leaving the violin box behind, containing the erroneous Latin message. Eduard, who we had informed, could not make any sense of that letter either. The content of the message doesn't seem entirely unwarranted, I said, as Holmes examined the room fragment by fragment. Eduard agreed. Johann is certainly not an ordinary person, but great talent also follows great responsibility. His manners are his own, and for the love of God, one should not weigh his every word. Also, is it true, I continued, that he has a whole army of enemies. Even if he is paranoid, Eduard replied, that doesn't mean he's not being pursued. The competition in Vienna is indeed considerable. There is a relentless struggle for the benefit of the crown. Every few weeks, the press discovers a new Shawnee, or a new musical prodigy. Johann's career was repeatedly declared as finished. Time and again, critics compare him to the Bohemian or Italian composers who are supposedly less profane. If I did not know what a terrible world that is, one would have to say there is truly a war in the Viennese musical scene, and the audience sometimes likes to exchange blows more than enjoying the music. This martial comparison made Holmes listen out. And you, Eduard? He asked abruptly. Are you the king's sword-bearer, or are you his Brutus? Eduard smiled. I'm the reliable regent of your dynasty, Mr. Holmes. No piece of paper on earth could fit between my brother and me. Holmes nodded and returned to his investigation. For a few minutes, there was silence in the room. Then, Holmes paused and turned to us. Well, gentlemen, he began, we want to record the facts. There are no traces of forced entry at the wardrobe door, or at the entrances of the house as a whole. With this, I can already refute a first assumption. The theft did not take place at night, but in the morning during the short time before the opening of the premises for the staff and the musicians and the arrival of Johann. Since the violin box was left behind, the thief walked out with the violin in his hand. From this, I conclude that the perpetrator must be one of the musicians, because it would not be unusual for a man to walk through the aisles with an instrument in his hand. Eduard's astonishment was evident. But that is... Yes, he began to stutter. That's outrageous, Mr. Holmes. Do you want to say that a member of my own orchestra is responsible for stealing my brother's violin? For now, I'm just reconstructing everything, Holmes said. There is no doubt that the act itself was committed by one of your musicians. However, this does not give us any indication about a motive. It is unclear whether this was done on their own initiative or on behalf of a third party, and the whereabouts of the violin are also unknown, although I assume that it has not left the concert hall. Eduard shook his head. I just rehearsed with the orchestra, he shouted. They are 41 hand-picked artists. And how many of them play the violin? Asked Holmes. 15, Eduard answered quickly. We have 10 first violins and 5 second ones. Holmes thought for a moment and then said, So we have 15 suspects, or 16, Mr. Strauss, if we want to add you too. The addressed raised his hands defensively. Thank you, I'll pass. But how shall we proceed? That is a considerable number. Do you want to question all the violinists? That might prove pointless, Holmes muttered as he walked up and down a few steps. We're going to have to approach things differently. And I already have an idea. Are the musicians still on stage? They are, Eduard confirmed. They are waiting for my return to continue the rehearsal. Then we should not have them wait any longer, exclaimed Holmes determinedly and headed to the door, which, right in that second, was opened by Johann. He came back from dinner. You're still here? He asked. Your investigation runs at a snail's pace. You haven't even left the starting point. My mind is where I am, Holmes said, smiling. And has your mind, Johann said with a smirk, already gained new insights? It has, said Eduard. There is a lead and suspects. For the first time, Johann's face brightened up a little. Is that true, Mr. Holmes? He asked, still suspicious. Holmes nodded. Unfortunately, I have to inform you, Johann, that the act was committed by a member of the orchestra. I knew it, Johann cried out immediately. I nurtured snake's brood at my bosom, shared my splendor, let them dine on my table and benefit from my ingenuity. And how do these talentless crooks thank me, with a nefarious dagger thrust into the back of their patron and master? It breaks my heart, but I need to know, who was it? We can't say that yet, Holmes said. We were able to narrow down the circle to 15 people. Now, it is necessary to filter out and convict the perpetrator. The Waltz King was still unstoppable. That won't be a problem. We are holding an inquisition. Undoubtedly, the perpetrator will collapse and confess under torture. We need fire, water, pliers, and knives. Honoring your archaic, zealous methods, however, Holmes interrupted him, I thought of a slightly more subtle approach, which also guarantees the physical integrity of the 14 innocents. I guarantee you that in my own way, which also abides law, by the way, we will achieve the desired success without causing too much damage. Johann seemed a little disappointed, but agreed. All right, let's try it your way, but if you fail, my patience and mercy will come to an end. Holmes instructed Eduard to separate the members of the orchestra. The 15 violinists remained in the concert hall and took their seats in the front row of the parquet. We sent the remaining 26 musicians, from flutists to percussionists, back to the hotel. Holmes then entered the stage while the Strauss brothers, the summoned Inspector Lestrade, and my humble self lined up next to the violinists. Holmes looked into the crowd. All of them kept a straight face. Good evening, gentlemen, Holmes began. I thank you for being here and for your patience. We are here to investigate a crime, and the perpetrator is among us. But let us continue step by step. This morning, there was a theft in this house, which went unnoticed at first. The concert violin was stolen from the maestro's wardrobe, the esteemed Mr. Johann Strauss II. It is a valuable, flawless instrument from the workshop of the Amati family from Cremona. But you all know that. Even before Mr. Strauss entered the house, the crime was committed. It did not cause any attention among the others present, because there is nothing special about a violinist walking around with a violin. The offender only had to be careful not to be observed when entering and leaving the dressing room, which was easily done in the morning hours with a little caution. The perpetrator left the maestro a written message in the empty violin box. On this piece of paper, there were only 3 words in Latin: Superbientium animum prosternet, was the message to Johann Strauss. A remark that does not give any indication of a possible motive, because I think all of you can identify with it. Forgive me, Mr. Strauss. But it is worth noting that the perpetrator may not have been a top student, because he made a beginner's mistake by confusing nominative and accusative. Do not resent me, gentlemen, but such a grammatical error in just 3 words is somewhat unworthy. I was absolutely certain that the perpetrator would still attend primary school, or at least be a well-trained chimpanzee. Laughter interrupted Holmes's remarks. Some violinists were very amused by this. Holmes then jumped off the stage and walked toward the first row of seats. One by one, he pointed the finger at 7 musicians and proclaimed, "You can go." Hesitantly, the selected men got up and left the room after Lestrade opened the door for them. 8 suspects were left behind. "What are you doing?" I whispered to Holmes. Holmes tilted his head to my right ear and said quietly, "These 7 men laughed at the flawed Latin and my cheap joke with the monkey. Therefore, they are eliminated as perpetrators. They didn't write the message." Then Holmes turned back to the remaining violinists. "Gentlemen, I must ask you to endure a little longer. Better knowledge of Latin would have saved you, but enough of it. Let's go back to the theft of the Amati violin." So the perpetrator calmly walked out of his dressing room with the maestro's violin. However, he had to appear here in the hall in time for rehearsal with Mr. Eduard Strauss. Therefore, The violin did not leave the building. The perpetrator did not have much time to hide the violin on the way between the wardrobe and the stage. There is no doubt that we will find it, but it would be easier if the perpetrator simply told us where it is. And he will soon be given the opportunity to do so. There is no doubt that we will convict the perpetrator. 8 of you are left, and I am certain that one of you gentlemen carried out the theft. Therefore, I am now going to address the perpetrator directly. Confess. Do us all a favor and end it. I would politely ask you to simply give me a sign by lifting your hand. Just identify yourself. Holmes waited a few seconds, but no one came forward. Well, it was worth a try, I whispered to Holmes. Did you really expect the perpetrator to come forward? No, Holmes replied. I expect the perpetrator to betray himself. Then he approached the third man from the left and said to him, You stole the violin. Mr. Schreivogel, exclaimed Johann angrily. I'm going to let him be split in fourths. The violinist in question shook his head and stammered, No, that's a mistake. Holmes quickly turned to Lestrade and said, Inspector, please arrest the man before Mr. Strauss steps into action. Holmes, Lestrade replied, I'm usually far from questioning your judgment. Nevertheless, I would like to know why you think this man is the perpetrator. Quite simply, Holmes said, smiling. When I asked for the perpetrator to give me a hand sign, all the violinists looked around, looked to the left and the right to see if anyone was reporting. Only Mr. Schreivogel here did not do this. He stared at me unwaveringly. Because, of course, being the perpetrator himself, he knew that the perpetrator would not come forward. Brilliant, Johann cried and approached Holmes. But where's my violin? Then he turned to the perpetrator. Speak, villain, or do I have to apply thumb screws first? That's not going to be necessary, Lestrade said, pulling up Mr. Schreivogel, leading him out of the room with his arms on his back. We have a good basis for a sufficiently comprehensive confession. With this assumption, the inspector should remain right. Even before the two had left the building, the perpetrator had already given away the hiding place of the Amati violin. It was hidden in the spectator toilet in the area of the ground floor in the front left of the building. It might have been an unfit storage place, but he was only going to hide it there until the following day. Then he planned on getting rid of it. When Lestrade came back, Mr. Schreivogel was in custody, on his way to prison in a police car. He handed Johann the violin. Seemingly, the concert was saved. Additionally, the perpetrator had also provided us with a motive. Mr. Strauss, asked Lestrade, do you know a Mr. Karl Michael Zierer? He is the one behind this act. Johann's face turned red. I knew it, he shouted. Of course I know Zierer. My mortal enemy, my nemesis, my Salieri. As it turned out, and I knew nothing about this, Mr. Zierer was a rising star in the Viennese music scene and a staunch competitor of the Strauss brothers. The statement of Mr. Schreivogel, however, was not enough to bring Mr. Zierer to justice or even prove any involvement. But the already given hatred was deepened once again. While Johann was torn between relief about regaining his violin and the anger at Zierer, Holmes turned to Eduard. What exactly did your brother mean when he said, my Salieri? Eduard laughed. That's kind of an obsession of his, he said. He is convinced that Zierer wants to not only ruin him, but also see him dead, just like Antonia Salieri did with Mozart. Johann thinks, Holmes asked incredulously, that Salieri killed Mozart? Quite right, Eduard confirmed. Holmes shook his head. What an absurd presumption, he said, and without any criminological base. If anything, this is a slander of Salieri's name. The next morning, Holmes and I sat comfortably at breakfast and went over the case. "You know," I said, "Johann Strauss may be an important composer of dance and operetta music, but his character is difficult, to say at least. I find it hard to assess it positively. Arrogance and mania are somewhat poor characteristics." "Certainly," Holmes replied. "He was not wrong about suspecting the sabotage of his competitors. We often wrongly demand that a flawless character goes alongside such flawless compositions. A great talent in one area can easily be accompanied by deficits in other areas. Artistic genius or scientific brilliance often correlate with a lack of social, interpersonal, or emotional intelligence." I had to smile. "You're probably talking from experience, Holmes, aren't you?" But Holmes looked at me utterly confused. "What do you mean, Watson? I don't understand that." "Exactly," I replied. "That is why." Holmes shook his head suspiciously as I tried to change the topic of the conversation. "The bottom line," I continued, "is that no real damage has been done. You've solved the crime, by the way, with the help of an excellent trick that is hardly worth mentioning in its ultimate substance." "Is that sympathy for the perpetrator, I notice?" asked Holmes. "Not sympathies," I said, "but understanding. In the orchestra of this tyrant, one becomes easily receptive to try and teach him a lesson." "Probably true," Holmes said, "but an explanation is far from an excuse. However, you don't really have to worry. Mr. Schreefvogel will be brought back to Vienna, where he will only receive a small penalty. His career will, of course, suffer a certain relapse, unless Mr. Zira accepts him into his orchestra." At that moment, someone knocked violently on the door. "Just come in," said Holmes, and the next moment, Eduard Strauss stood in front of us again. "Good morning, gentlemen," he began without further ado. "There are new problems. Tonight's concert is on a knife's edge. The concert might have to be cancelled again. You are my last hope." "What's going on?" I asked. "Has your brother lost something again?" "No," Eduard replied. "Well, to be precise, yes. Yes, in a way." "Maybe his violin bow?" I joked. "The situation is serious," Eduard replied, looking serious. "My brother refuses to stand up." Holmes frowned. "Why is this?" "Well," Eduard answered slowly, looking at Holmes forcefully, "Mr. Schreefvogel is in prison. He was one of our second violins. We are missing him now. Our orchestra always performs with 10 first and 5 second. There is no other way for Johann. I urgently need a replacement. I need an extraordinary violin player, right away. The dress rehearsal starts in an hour." "And why are you telling me that?" asked Holmes, though he could already guess the answer. On the evening of the same day, the Strauss Orchestra, conducted by Johann and Eduard, performed a highly acclaimed concert at London's James's Hall. An enthusiastic audience demanded no less than 8 encores. The reviews in the newspapers were full of praise on the following day for the brilliant appearance of the guests from Vienna. What no one knew, however, was that on this evening, in addition to 40 professional musicians from Austria, an English amateur also sat in this orchestra and played the second violin with his Stradivarius.